He hadn't left the room since his mother left, but that day the millionaire came home and saw the new nanny, poor, kneeling on the grass, planting flowers with his son. 2 minutes later, he did something no one expected. The white gate of the waterfront mansion in the Hamptons creaked, a metallic complaint that seemed to echo the weight of the silence dominating the estate. For Arthur, each creak was a reminder that something vital had been lost. Within those cold marble walls, where life once pulsed with laughter and conversation, now only the suffocating memory of a happy time remained. He lived like a ghost in his own home. A man who had built an incalculable fortune, but had lost the cornerstone of his existence. Since his wife, Isabella, had passed, the house had transformed into a luxury mausoleum, a black and white portrait of a broken family. His business, which involved high-stakes trading in stocks and crypto, continued to thrive, but the profits accumulating in his bank account seemed like a meaningless pile of numbers. He would stare at the performance charts on his high-definition screen, but his emotional portfolio was deep in the red. His net worth grew with every second, but his soul shrank in equal measure. Upstairs, in a room with perpetually drawn curtains, lived his 5-year-old son, Leo. Diagnosed with autism, the little boy had retreated into a private world, a profound silence that not even the morning sun could penetrate. For months, he hadn't left his domain, a sanctuary of untouched toys and long shadows. Arthur tried to fill the void with work, immersing himself in bold, impersonal architectural projects that earned him awards and international acclaim, but failed to build a bridge to his son's heart. The days repeated in a grey monotony, a colourless film spinning endlessly. He was a multi-millionaire whose greatest wealth amounted to a silence shared with his own son. Each new contract signed, each successful investment, was just another layer of insulation, until, on a morning of unexpected blue, a figure passed through the gate. Her name was Elena. She didn't carry a glowing resume or references from affluent families. She brought a heart that had learned to blossom with little, a resilience forged in the hardships of life. Her simple clothing, a floral cotton dress, clashed with the opulence of the entrance hall. Her worn shoes stepped with an almost reverent lightness on the Italian marble, but her gaze carried a gentle firmness, the strength of someone who knew pain up close but refused to stop believing in rebirth. The meeting between them was a collision of universes. Arthur, contained in his designer suit, spoke of rules, schedules, and medical protocols. His voice was a controlled murmur, the sound of a man who feared anything that might disturb the fragile order of his suffering. Elena, with her straight posture and clasped hands, spoke of patience, of flowers, and the healing power of affection. She wasn't intimidated by the wealth around her. Her eyes saw only the pain behind the polished facade. He hired her for one reason only, the insistence of Leo's therapist, a last resort, a faithless gamble Arthur couldn't have imagined. As he watched her standing in the middle of his lavish living room, that destiny had just walked through the front door, bringing with it the seeds of a transformation he didn't even know he needed. He escorted her to the kitchen, where the housekeeper, Mrs. Elvira, a woman who had been with the house for decades and held a fierce loyalty to Isabella's memory, awaited her. Elvira sized her up from head to toe with an icy gaze, a veiled contempt for the simplicity of her clothes and the absence of sophisticated credentials. As Arthur retreated, leaving the two alone, the housekeeper handed Elena a clipboard with a list of rules and tasks. Her voice was as sharp as broken glass. "The first rule, and the most important," Elvira said, her thin lips barely moving, "is never, under any circumstances, attempt to approach the back garden. That place is off-limits. Forever." Eleanor's first days in the mansion were like walking on a thin sheet of ice. Every step was calculated, every word measured. Mrs. Elvira followed her with her eyes, a vigilant shadow ready to point out any misstep. The veteran housekeeper, who had known the home's glory days, saw Elena as an intruder, the neighborhood nanny, as she'd dubbed her in a disdainful whisper to one of the maids. She was convinced the young woman wouldn't last a week. The list of rules was endless, a manual on how to become invisible, speak softly, walk along the edges of the rooms, do not touch the decor, and above all, maintain a professional distance from Leo. The boy needs routine, not attachments, Elvira had warned her, with the authority of someone who considered herself the guardian of the family's order and memory. Arthur, for his part, reinforced this distance with his silence. He avoided crossing paths with her in the hallways, their interactions limited to brief instructions given through the half-open door of his office. He didn't ask about her day, didn't look her in the eye, didn't show the slightest interest in who the woman he had entrusted with his son's care was. It was an invisible barrier, but as solid as the mansion's concrete walls. Elena spent most of her time sitting outside Leo's room. She didn't force her way in. She just sat in the hallway with the door ajar and spoke in a soft voice. She told stories of sparrows building nests in tall trees, of seeds that traveled with the wind to find a place to bloom. Her voice was a constant murmur, a quiet melody trying to cross the boy's wall of silence. Sometimes she would bring a small flower she found on her way to work and leave it on the rug near the crack of the door. Elvira reprimanded her for it. "Flowers bring dirt into the house," she would say, picking up the small petal with her fingertips as if touching something contagious. Elena would just smile, a patient smile that seemed to disarm the housekeeper's hostility, if only for a moment. She understood the pain behind Elvira's rigidity, the loyalty to a mistress who was no longer there. What the housekeeper didn't know was that Elena's persistence didn't come from naivete, but from a profound need. The salary she earned was the only source of income for her mother's mounting medical bills and to help her teenage brother save for college. Every day in that house was a battle won for her family. On a particularly grey afternoon, as the sea breeze brought the scent of salt and loneliness, Elena found herself drawn to an area at the back of the property. It was the forbidden garden, surrounded by a tall, unkempt hedge with a wrought iron gate already beginning to rust. The prohibition, instead of deterring her, sparked her curiosity. There was something in its neglect that called to her. She approached, peering through the bars. The weeds had grown tall and wild, choking what had clearly once been a place of beauty and care. Twisted, flowerless rose bushes looked like skeletal claws pointing to the sky. A small stone fountain was dry and covered in moss. It was a sad place, a mirror of the grief that inhabited the house. That's when she saw it, amid the chaos and neglect, a tiny speck of color. A single, stubborn little flower, a vibrant violet, that had managed to break through the tangle of weeds to reach the sunlight. It was a sign of life, a promise of resilience, and it was there, watching that little flower, that Elena began to form a plan. She didn't know how or when, but she felt that the key to reaching the boy's heart was not in the silent room, but here, in this forgotten piece of land. Late that night, when the house was steeped in darkness and silence, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The image of the little violet flower wouldn't leave her mind. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand herself, she got up and tiptoed down the stairs. The mansion was even more intimidating at night, shadows dancing over the expensive furniture. She slipped out the back door and walked across the dew-damp grass to the garden gate. It was locked, just as Elvira had assured, but as she ran her hand along the thick chain, she felt something small and cold, a key, old, rusted, almost swallowed by the vines growing around the gate. Someone had left it there, hidden, like a secret waiting to be discovered. Her heart pounding erratically, Elena took the key. The cold metal seemed to burn her skin. She looked back at the dark house, at the window of Arthur's study, where a single light was on. A sudden fear shot through her, the possibility of losing everything. But the desire to try, to bring life back to that place and perhaps to that family was stronger. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the lock. The turn of the key in the rusted lock produced a metallic groan, a long, drawn-out protest that seemed to tear through the silence of the early morning. Elena held her breath, hoping the sound wouldn't travel to the mansion's bedrooms. When nothing happened, she pushed the gate, which moved with a reluctant slowness. The scent that greeted her was of damp earth and decaying leaves, the perfume of neglect and time. She stepped inside, closing the gate behind her with infinite care. In here, the world felt different. Wild ivy covered the stone walls and tangled around the feet of angel statues, whose faces were stained by tears of moss. It was a place that breathed longing. Elena felt, in an almost palpable way, the presence of the woman who had once tended this garden. It wasn't a frightening presence, but a melancholic one, like the last note of a sad song. She imagined Isabella there, her hands in the dirt, smiling at the sun. This wasn't an act of trespass, she decided, but one of continuation, a silent tribute. With the first light of dawn painting the sky in pale shades of pink and orange, Eleanor began her work. She had no tools, so she used her bare hands. She started small, in the exact spot where she had seen the violet flower. With surgical delicacy, she began to pull the weeds, one by one, freeing the little survivor. The work was slow and demanded patience. Her fingernails filled with dirt, and small scratches appeared on her arms, but she felt no pain. She felt a purpose. With every handful of weeds she pulled, she felt as if she were clearing not just a patch of earth, but also a bit of the sadness that permeated the air. Hidden under dense foliage, she found a pair of canvas gardening gloves, dried out by time but still intact. As she put them on, she felt a strange, comforting connection, as if the garden's former mistress were giving her permission. Arthur saw the world through balance sheets, through assets and liabilities. To him, that garden was a liability, a dead space in his vast portfolio of properties. For Elena, it was an investment of a different kind, a capital of hope. She worked in secret, dedicating her spare hours in the early morning and late afternoon when the house was quietest. The fear of being discovered was a constant knot in her stomach. One morning, she heard the sound of the kitchen's glass door sliding open. She froze, hiding behind a large wild rose bush. It was Mrs. Elvira, a coffee mug in her hands, her gaze lost on the sea's horizon. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. The housekeeper stood there for long minutes, her face impassive, before turning and going back inside. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That close call served to reinforce her caution, but not to diminish her determination. She knew she was risking the job that supported her family, the money that paid for her mother's medicine. But something greater compelled her. A conviction that the cure for this house would not come from rules and protocols, but from the life that sprouted from the earth. In the days that followed, the small patch of land around the violet flower began to transform. Elena found other small seedlings, suffocated but still alive, and gave them room to breathe. The sound of her work, previously non-existent in the mansion's silent routine, began to subtly filter into the environment. It wasn't a loud noise, but a whisper of activity, the rustle of leaves being gathered, the soft sound of her hands turning the soil. They were the sounds of life. Inside his room upstairs, Leo was sitting on the floor, lining up his wooden blocks with methodical precision. The world outside was an indistinct hum, a soundscape he had learned to ignore. But on that day, a different sound reached his ears. It wasn't the roar of the sea, nor the wind, nor the distant engine of a car. It was a small, rhythmic, and close sound, a sound of earth being moved. Curious, he stopped what he was doing, his head tilted slightly, like a bird alert to an unusual noise. For the first time in many months, something from outside his door had managed to breach the barrier of his silence. Slowly, he got up. His small, bare feet moved noiselessly over the soft carpet toward the window. With his fingertips, he parted a tiny sliver in the heavy velvet curtain. Through the sliver in the curtain, the world was a fragment of color and motion. Leo didn't see a woman cleaning a garden. He saw a blur of blue and pink, the flowers on Elena's dress, moving against a backdrop of green and brown. The sounds were soft, rhythmic. The scraping of dry leaves, the turning of the soil. For a boy whose universe had shrunk to the four walls of his room, that small window to the outside was hypnotic. There were no loud voices, no demands, no sad and confused looks from adults. There was only a calm presence, absorbed in a task he didn't understand, but that conveyed a sense of peace. He remained there, his small body rigid, his eyes fixed on the scene, until the colorful blur stood up and disappeared from his field of vision. Only then did he let the curtain fall, plunging the room back into familiar gloom. But something had changed. A seed of curiosity had been planted in his silent soil. Elena, for her part, had no idea she was being watched. That garden had become her sanctuary, a refuge from the heavy atmosphere of the house. There, with her hands in the dirt, she wasn't the neighborhood nanny, the employee under Mrs. Elvira's constant scrutiny. She was just Elena. She felt connected to something real and tangible, something the mansion's wealth couldn't buy. The smell of damp earth, the sight of the small seedlings fighting for life, all of it replenished her. She thought about the contrast between her life and her employer's. Arthur dealt in millions, moving his capital between investment funds and the stock market, accumulating a fortune she could barely imagine, and yet he seemed so poor in joy. She, with the little money she earned, felt an immense richness in that abandoned patch of ground. The interest on her effort wouldn't be measured in dividends, but in the possibility of seeing color return to that boy's life. The next day, Leo didn't go to the window, but he did something even more extraordinary. He approached the door to his room and opened it, just an inch. The hallway was silent, empty. He stood there, listening to the distant sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator from downstairs, the ticking of an old clock. And then he heard Eleanor's soft footsteps approaching. She was coming, as always. To sit outside, Leo quickly retreated, closing the door without a sound, but the door didn't latch completely. It remained ajar. When Eleanor arrived and saw the small crack, her heart leaped. She knew what it meant. It wasn't an oversight, it was an invitation, a permission. She sat in her usual spot, but that day, her stories of sparrows and seeds were told with a voice thick with emotion. That afternoon, on her day off, Elena used a small part of her salary to buy something she considered a crucial investment. At a small local nursery, she chose packets of sunflower and daisy seeds, simple flowers, but full of color and life. It was an expense she would feel, but her gut told her it was the right path. The next morning, very early, she returned to her secret garden. This time, however, she didn't lock the gate behind her. She left it just ajar, a passage, with a small, rusted handrake she'd found hidden under a pot. She prepared a new flower bed, a spot where the morning sun hit strongest. Carefully, she opened the seed packets and let them fall onto the soft earth, covering them gently as if tucking a baby into a cradle. As she worked, a strange feeling washed over her, the certainty that she was not alone. She slowly raised her eyes, expecting to see Leo's silhouette in the upstairs window, but the window was empty, the curtain drawn. A pang of disappointment hit her. Maybe she had imagined it. She lowered her gaze back to the earth, but then something made her freeze. A peripheral movement from the house. She turned her head slowly, and there he was, not at the window, but at the glass door leading to the backyard. The small figure of Leo was standing on the threshold, half of his body in, half out, his bare feet touching the stone sill. He had left his room. Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment. The sound of the ocean, the rustle of leaves, everything faded away, replaced by a silence heavy with expectation. Elena remained motionless, kneeling in the dirt, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. To move, to speak, to breathe too loudly, all felt like a risk. Leo stood there, a small spectre in the doorframe, the morning sunlight illuminating his brown hair. His eyes, large and serious, weren't focused on her, but on the dark earth she was turning, on the vibrant colors of the seed packets scattered beside her. He looked like a cautious explorer on the border of a new world. The boy stood there for a minute that felt like an eternity, his small fingers clutching the edge of the door. Then, with deliberate slowness, he took one step out, and then another. He was in the yard, outside the house. For the first time in months, Elena felt tears burn her eyes, but she held them back. The emotion was an overwhelming wave, a mixture of triumph and tenderness. All the risk, all the fear of being discovered, had been worth it for this moment. She didn't turn to him, didn't call his name. She pretended to continue her work, keeping her movements slow and predictable. With her peripheral vision, she tracked the boy's hesitant progress. He didn't walk in a straight line toward her, but followed a meandering path, stopping to observe a fallen leaf, to touch the rough texture of a tree trunk. It was as if he were rediscovering the world. Finally, he stopped at a safe distance, near a moss-covered stone bench, and sat down. He remained there, silent, just watching. His presence was a tacit approval, a quiet companionship. The morning unfolded in this tranquil rhythm. Elena planted seeds, and Leo watched. They didn't exchange a single word, but the communication between them was profound, woven in the threads of silence and shared curiosity. When the sun began to grow stronger, Elena knew it was time to stop. Slowly, she stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands on her jeans. Only then did she allow herself to look directly at him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In the boy's gaze, she saw no fear or anxiety, but a calmness she had never witnessed. She gave him a small, soft smile, and then turned and walked back into the house, leaving him alone in the yard. Minutes later, peeking through the kitchen window, she saw Leo still sitting on the bench, his gaze fixed on the newly planted bed, as if he could watch the flowers grow in real time. That evening, the atmosphere in the mansion was different. There was a lightness in the air, an undercurrent of change that only the most sensitive could perceive. Arthur arrived late from a meeting about a new high-rise complex, a deal that promised an astronomical profit and would further swell his already vast portfolio. He entered the house tired, his mind still spinning with numbers, projections, and investment strategies. He crossed the entrance hall, loosening his tie, and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when Mrs. Elvira approached him. The housekeeper wore an unreadable expression, a mix of astonishment and, was it resentment? "You won't believe it, sir," she began, her voice lower than usual. "The boy, he left his room today." Arthur stopped, the glass halfway to his lips. His first feeling was disbelief, followed by a relief so intense it nearly made him dizzy. What? Where did he go?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "To the backyard," Mrs. Elvira answered, and then added, a hint of venom in her words. "He was watching the new Nanny in the forbidden garden." Arthur's relief shattered, replaced by a cold wave of alarm and irritation. The garden, Isabella's place, the sanctuary he had ordered to remain untouched. He set the glass down hard on the counter, the water sloshing dangerously. "What was she doing there?" His voice was hard. "She disobeyed you. She broke the most important rule." Mrs. Elvira remained silent, her expression confirming the accusation. Blinded by anger and an old pain he refused to examine, Arthur took the stairs 2 at a time, his steps heavy on the marble. He didn't stop to think. He didn't consider the miracle that had occurred. The only thing his mind registered was the violation, the invasion of a sacred space. He stormed down the hall and stopped in front of Elena's door. He didn't knock, he just turned the handle forcefully and threw the door open. Elena was sitting on the edge of her simple bedroom bed, writing a letter to her mother. The lamplight cast a golden circle on the paper, where she was describing the day's small victories, carefully omitting the luxurious setting and constant tension. The sound of the door flying open made her jump, the pen scratching across the paper. She shot to her feet, her heart pounding at the sight of Arthur's towering figure in the doorway. His eyes, normally controlled and distant, now burned with a cold fury. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, and his always impeccable hair was slightly disheveled. He looked like a man undone, the facade of control cracked, revealing the raw pain underneath. "What do you think you were doing?" His voice was low, but charged with an intensity that filled the small room. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Elena, still reeling from the shock, just stared at him, uncomprehending. "In the garden," he continued, taking a step inside, "I gave a clear order, one rule, and you defied it." She finally understood. The fear, which had been dormant beneath the joy of Leo's progress, wrapped around her like a cold shroud. Losing this job meant the collapse of her small world. It meant not being able to pay for the medical treatments that kept her mother stable, maybe even having to pull her brother out of school. Her entire future was in this mansion. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling, "I was just—" "Leo!" He cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Don't use my son as an excuse for your insubordination." He spat the words. "That place is sacred. You have no right to set foot in there, to touch anything. You have no idea what that garden meant." The pain in his voice was so palpable it momentarily silenced the anger. Elena saw, behind the authoritarian multimillionaire, a man drowning in grief, a man who protected his wife's memory with the same ferocity he protected his fortune. "I understand," she said, her voice now steadier. "But your son left his room today because of that garden. He connected with something alive." The mention of his son seemed to enrage him further, as if she'd touched an exposed nerve. "You know nothing about my son. You are an employee. Your job is to follow the rules, not play therapist with your ridiculous ideas about flowers and seeds." He took another step, closing the space between them. Elena instinctively backed away until her back met the cold wall. She felt cornered, small beneath the weight of his wealth and power. He was a man accustomed to buying solutions, to managing his assets and businesses with swift, merciless decisions. Firing a nanny was just another transaction, cutting an emotional expense. "You're fired," he said, the sentence falling like a guillotine blade. "Pack your things. I want you out of here in an hour." The final judgment had been passed. There was no room for appeal. Elena's world crumbled. Images of her mother, of her brother, flashed through her mind in a desperate blur. The tears she had held back all day finally escaped, streaming silently down her face. Arthur saw the tears, but his heart was shielded by pain and anger. He turned to leave, to end the uncomfortable interaction, but as he turned, his gaze was drawn to the small desk. On it was the letter Elena had been writing, and beside it, a photo in a simple frame. It was a picture of Elena smiling next to a white-haired woman in a wheelchair and a teenage boy with a grin full of braces. They were in a small, makeshift garden full of terracotta pots with colorful flowers. The happiness in the photo was so genuine, so simple, that it contrasted violently with the sterile opulence of his own home. For an instant, Arthur's shield wavered. He saw in her not just an insubordinate employee, but a person with a life, with responsibilities, with a love he himself had lost. What was he doing? He was about to speak, perhaps to reconsider, when a sound from the hallway made them both freeze. It was the unmistakable sound of Leo's bare feet, running down the hall. The bedroom door, which Arthur had left open, was pushed wider. Leo entered, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear at the sound of his father's raised voice. He ran, but not to Arthur. He ran straight to Elena, clung to her legs, and buried his face in her dress, his small body trembling. And then he looked up at his father, and with eyes full of tears, he whispered a single word, the first anyone had heard him say in over a year. "Stay." The word floated in the tense air of the small room, tiny, yet with the weight of an avalanche. Stay. A fragile sound, almost a breath. But it demolished Arthur's wall of fury in a single instant. The fire in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a mute shock, a disbelief so profound it made him take a step back, as if he had been physically struck. His son, his silent son, lost in an inaccessible world, had spoken, and the first word he chose wasn't daddy, wasn't mommy. It was a request, a plea, directed at her. Arthur looked from Leo's frightened face, clinging to Elena's legs, to her face, bathed in silent tears that were not of fear or pain, but of overwhelming relief. In that moment, she was not the employee who had broken a rule. She was his son's anchor, the one person in the world who had managed to reach him. The realization hit him with the force of a punch. All his money, all his fortune and his vast assets were useless. He had built an empire but had failed to build the most important bridge of all. Elena, meanwhile, barely registered Arthur's presence. Her entire universe was focused on the small head nestled against her, the trembling of the little body she wrapped her arms around. She knelt on the floor, heedless of her employer's authority, and hugged Leo tightly, whispering words of comfort into his hair. "It's okay, sweet boy. I'm here, it's okay." She felt the boy's heart racing against hers, and for the first time, she felt his heart respond. He was no longer a fragile, distant doll. He was a scared child seeking protection, and he had chosen her. That choice, that act of trust, ignited a courage inside her she didn't know she possessed. The fear for her job dissipated, replaced by a fierce clarity. This was no longer about a salary or rules. It was about this boy. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound strange and out of place in the charged silence. He was lost. The instruction manual that governed his life, logic, business, cause and effect, had no page for this. He looked at the scene on the floor, the simple Nanny and his son, forming a circle of affection that excluded him. The anger had curdled into a hollow shame. He had been about to fire the only person who had brought a miracle into his home. "You..." His voice failed him. He tried again. "You can stay." The words came out like a concession, the sound of a king admitting defeat. He expected gratitude, perhaps a tearful relief, but that's not what happened. Slowly, Eleanor lifted her gaze from the boy to him. Her eyes, still wet, held no submission, but a new, unshakable strength. She rose to her feet, bringing Leo with her, who now held her hand with surprising force. "I'll stay," she said, her voice clear and firm. "But on one condition." Arthur frowned, taken aback. "A condition? No one gave him conditions." "This isn't about disobeying a rule, sir. This is about finding a way back to life. The garden isn't just a place. It's a language Leo understands. It's the language of care, of growth, of patience. Things no amount of capital in the world can buy." She took a deep breath, her gaze locked on his. "My condition is this. I will no longer work in that garden alone. The three of us will work on it. Together. You, me, and him. He doesn't just need to see the flowers grow. He needs to see his father with his hands in the dirt, helping life to bloom." It was the turning point. A proposal so unexpected, so audacious, it left Arthur utterly speechless. She wasn't asking for a raise. She wasn't negotiating her terms. She was offering him a chance, one he was too proud to ask for himself. She was inviting him into his own son's world. The invitation required him to do the one thing he had spent years avoiding, confront the epicenter of his pain, Isabella's garden. He looked at his son's hand holding hers, a perfect link. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a movement in the hallway. Mrs. Elvira stood there, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. She had witnessed everything, the miracle, the confrontation, and the impossible ultimatum. Elena's ultimatum hung in the air, a proposal so radical it reconfigured the power dynamics within the house. Arthur, the billionaire accustomed to dictating the terms of any deal, to assessing risk and calculating the return on every move, found himself facing an investment whose yield was impossible to quantify. He looked at Elena, whose posture now radiated a quiet authority, and at his son, who still clung to her hand as if it were the only solid thing in the world. His entire empire, built on audacious deals, investments in gold, and an enviable cash flow, felt irrelevant. He could move millions of dollars with a phone call, but he couldn't move his own son's heart. Her condition wasn't about money or privilege. It was about presence, about sharing vulnerability. It was an invitation to descend from his ivory tower and get his hands dirty, literally. Mrs. Elvira, still standing in the hall, watched the scene with a complex expression. The contempt she felt for the neighborhood nanny warred with the awe of having heard Leo's voice. For years, she had cared for the house like a museum, preserving Isabella's order and memory with fierce loyalty. But seeing little Leo speak, seeing the spark of life in his eyes, had shaken her convictions. Perhaps true loyalty wasn't about preserving the ashes of the past, but about rekindling the fire of life. Without a word, the housekeeper retreated, leaving behind a silence that pressed Arthur for an answer. He took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy in his lungs. He looked at the joined hands of his son and Elena. "Fine," he said, his voice hoarse, sounding strange to his own ears. "Tomorrow, after breakfast, be in the garden." It was not a warm agreement, but an acceptance, a contract signed against his will, but dictated by his heart. The next morning, the atmosphere was charged with a strange formality. Eleanor got Leo ready, who seemed to sense the shift in the air. There was an electricity in his movements, a curiosity in his eyes. At 9 o'clock sharp, Elena and Leo went out to the backyard. The garden, in the morning light, seemed less a place of mourning and more a space of potential. Arthur was already there. He looked terribly out of place. He wore immaculate linen pants and a polo shirt, clothes that, while casual by his standards, were absurdly unsuited for gardening. He stood with his arms crossed, observing a patch of weeds with the same expression he would use to analyze a report on underperforming assets. He looked like a king visiting the poorest province in his kingdom. Elena approached without haste. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm. She handed him a pair of gardening gloves she had found in the small shed. They were Isabella's gloves. Arthur took them, the soft, worn leather, a familiar ghost in his hands. He put them on in silence. "We can start here." Elena indicated the bed she had been clearing in the previous days. "The soil needs to be loosened so the new seed's roots can breathe." She handed him a small hand rake. Arthur held the tool as if it were an alien object. He, who signed off on skyscraper designs, felt utterly inept before a square foot of dirt. Leo sat on the stone bench again, his observation post, his little feet dangling inches from the ground. Arthur knelt, the expensive fabric of his pants protesting. The gesture was stiff, clumsy. He drove the rake into the earth with too much force, then with too little. He felt ridiculous, exposed. Every movement felt like a mistake. Elena worked beside him in silence, showing him the rhythm, the right pressure, not with words, but with her example. Gradually, a rhythm was established. The only sound was the turning of the soil, the song of a bird, and their breathing. Arthur began to feel the muscles in his shoulders, tight from years of stress and grief, relax minimally. The texture of the dirt, the smell of life, it was all so fundamentally real. A stark contrast to the abstract world of finance and business. He was so focused on the strange task that he barely noticed when his hand, sinking into the soil, hit something hard. It wasn't a rock. Curious, he dug around it with his fingers and pulled the object out. It was a small ceramic plaque caked with dirt. He wiped it with his thumb. The paint was faded, but the delicate script was unmistakable. It was Isabella's handwriting, and on the plaque, a single painted word, always. The word always on the small ceramic plaque was like an echo from the past, a voice Arthur thought he had silenced under layers of work and isolation. Isabella's script, elegant and full of life, instantly transported him to a sunny afternoon years ago in this very garden. He remembered her burying the plaque next to a jasmine seedling, smiling. "So we never forget," she had said, "that love is like this plant. It needs constant care to bloom forever." The memory hit him with a physical force, a punch of longing that left him breathless. There, kneeling in the dirt, holding the ghost of his wife in his hands, the world of stocks, profits, and dividends seemed like an absurd fiction. What was the value of his entire net worth against this piece of ceramic? He remained motionless, the plaque in his palm, his gaze lost in the void. Elena, beside him, noticed the change in his posture. She saw the rigidity in his shoulders, the way his fingers closed around the object. She didn't ask, didn't intrude. She just gave him the space of silence, an act of compassion worth more than any words of comfort. She continued her work, turning the soil with gentle movements, creating a cocoon of normalcy around his pain. Leo, from his observation bench, seemed to sense the wave of sadness emanating from his father. He stopped swinging his feet, his large eyes fixed on Arthur, not with fear, but with a quiet, almost empathetic curiosity. It was as if, for the first time, he was seeing his father not as a distant authority figure, but as a human being. After several long minutes, Arthur placed the ceramic plaque carefully beside the flower bed, as if it were a sacred treasure. He said nothing, but when he resumed his work with the rake, something had changed. His movements were less stiff, more deliberate. There was less anger and more melancholy in his effort. They worked together for the rest of the morning, the silence between them no longer tense, but contemplative. When the sun grew high, Elena stood up. "I think that's enough for today," she said softly. Arthur nodded, rising with difficulty, his unaccustomed muscles protesting. He looked at his hands, covered in dirt, at the smudges on his linen pants. He felt exhausted, but it was a different kind of tired, a physical fatigue that brought a strange peace to his hyperactive mind. In the days that followed, gardening became a ritual. Every morning, the three of them met in the garden. Arthur, reluctantly at first, began to surrender to the routine. He learned to differentiate weeds from seedlings, to feel the moisture of the soil, to recognize the right time to water. Elena was his silent guide, teaching him with gestures and patience. Leo remained the observer, but his distance shrank with each passing day. He abandoned the stone bench and took to sitting on the grass, closer to the action. Sometimes he would reach out to touch a leaf or a petal. They were tiny bridges he was building, inch by inch, off his island of silence. The transformation of the garden became a mirror of the transformation occurring within them. The cleared beds, the sprouting seeds, the first green leaves breaking through the dark earth. It was all a testament that life, with the right care, could flourish even in the most neglected soil. One afternoon, while Arthur and Elena were planting lavender seedlings, Leo came closer than ever. He crouched beside his father, his eyes fixed on an earthworm wriggling in the turned soil. Arthur stopped, his hand in midair, unsure how to react. It was Elena who broke the spell. With a smile, she picked up a small empty pot and a trowel. She put a little soil in the pot and held it out to Leo. "Do you want to plant a flower of your own?" she asked, her voice like a melody. The boy looked at the pot, then at the nanny's hand, and then at his father's face. Arthur held his breath. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Leo reached out and took the trowel. There were no words, but the gesture was monumental. He scooped up a bit of soil and clumsily put it inside the pot. Arthur felt such a surge of emotion in his throat that he had to turn away to hide his tears. His son wasn't just planting a seed, he was planting a root back in the world. And he, Arthur, was there to witness it, not as a distant spectator, but as part of that fertile ground. In that moment, he felt a flood of gratitude for Eleanor so intense it frightened him. Her presence in his home, which had once felt like an intrusion, now revealed itself to be an investment of incalculable value, the most precious inheritance he could ever leave his son. Leo's small seedling became the center of the garden's universe. Every morning, the first thing he did was run to his pot, inspecting it with the seriousness of a botanist. Arthur watched him, fascinated and his heart aching. That little plant was a barometer of his son's recovery. Every millimeter of growth, every new leaf, was a victory celebrated in silence by the three of them. The garden routine began to spill over into the house. The door to Leo's room now remained always open. Sometimes he would venture down the hall, following the soft melody Elena hummed in the kitchen or the sound of Arthur's fingers on his computer keyboard. The mansion's silence was no longer oppressive. It was punctuated by the small sounds of life. Arthur, for his part, found himself in uncharted emotional territory. The gratitude he felt for Elena was an undercurrent that destabilized him. He had spent so long building walls around his heart that the simple idea of feeling something for another woman felt like a betrayal of Isabella's memory. He began to watch her differently. He noticed the way the sunlight caught in her hair when she bent over a flower bed, the infinite patience in her gestures with Leo, the serene strength in her gaze. She possessed a wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or euros, a fortune of spirit that left him bewildered and, to his own surprise, deeply attracted. This attraction terrified him. It was an internal conflict that left him irritable and distant. In an effort to re-establish control, he tried to raise the barriers again. "Remember, this is a professional arrangement, Eleanor," he told her one morning, his voice harsher than he intended. "We shouldn't confuse things." Elena just looked at him, her clear eyes reading the insecurity behind the authoritarian facade. "I never forget, sir," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer completely disarmed him. As spring progressed, the garden bloomed in an explosion of color. The daisies, sunflowers, and lavender transformed the abandoned place into a vibrant oasis. The change was so remarkable that even Mrs. Elvira, the skeptical housekeeper, was seen one afternoon standing by the gate, her face softened by a reluctant admiration. The relationship between her and Eleanor had also shifted. Hostility had given way to a quiet respect. Mrs. Elvira began leaving a glass of fresh lemonade for Eleanor on the patio, a small gesture of truce and acknowledgement. The whole house seemed to be breathing a new, lighter air. The turning point in Arthur and Eleanor's relationship came during a sudden thunderstorm. One afternoon, the blue sky turned gray in minutes, and a heavy rain began to fall, accompanied by thunder that shook the windows. Leo, who was in the garden with Elena, panicked. The loud, sudden noise overwhelmed him. He began to tremble, hands clamped over his ears, a low moan escaping his lips. Elena hugged him, trying to shield him, but he was inconsolable. Arthur, working in his office, heard the commotion and ran outside. He saw his son's desperation and the veiled panic on Eleanor's face. Without thinking, he swept Leo into his arms, a gesture he hadn't made in years, and carried him inside. "It's okay, champ. It's just the rain," he said, his voice firm but full of a tenderness he didn't recognize in himself. He took Leo into his office, a place the boy had never entered, and sat him in his large leather chair. Elena followed them, soaked and worried. Inside the office, sheltered from the storm's noise, Leo began to calm down. Arthur, still acting on instinct, started talking about the rain, explaining how it helped the flowers grow strong. He pointed to the charts on his screen. "See, it's like the stock market," he said, simplifying the complex language of business. "Sometimes there's a downturn, a storm. Everything looks scary. But if you have good roots, good investments, you survive and grow even stronger afterward." Leo listened, his eyes wide, fascinated. Elena watched from the doorway, her heart overflowing. She was watching a father reconnect with his son, using his own language to build a bridge. When the storm passed and a rainbow appeared in the sky, Leo was already calm, drawing on a notepad Arthur had given him. Arthur looked at Elena, their eyes meeting over the boy's head. In that gaze, all the barriers crumbled. There was gratitude, admiration, and something more, something deeper and scarier that neither of them dared to name. The morning after the storm broke with a stunning clarity, as if the rain had washed the world clean. The peace that settled over the mansion was palpable, a quiet that came not from an absence of sound, but from the presence of harmony. For the first time, Arthur didn't come down for breakfast wearing his businessman's armor. He wore a simple t-shirt and looked younger, his shoulders less tense. When Leo saw him, he ran toward him and said a new word, clear as a bell, "Daddy." Arthur froze, then knelt and hugged his son with a force that surprised him. His eyes met Elena's across the table, and he gave her a smile, a genuine smile, free from the shackles of formality or pain. In that instant, he was not the boss, and she was not the employee. They were two people witnessing a small miracle they had cultivated together. The complicity between them deepened. Arthur began to ask about her life, about her mother's health, about her brother's dreams. He listened with an attentiveness that made her feel seen, valued not just for what she did for Leo, but for who she was. One day, he found her in the library, looking at a large art book. "You like Monet?" he asked. "I love him," she replied. He saw the light in a different way. Arthur took the book and began showing her his favorite works, explaining the details, the history behind the brushstrokes. They talked for nearly an hour, forgetting time, two souls connecting through beauty. Leo played on the rug at their feet, the sound of his toy cars providing a soundtrack to their peaceful moment. But this new harmony did not go unnoticed. From the half-open door, Mrs. Elvira watched. To her, the scene was not one of tenderness, but of trespass. Every smile exchanged between Arthur and Elena was a stab at her loyalty to Isabella. She saw Elena not as Leo's savior, but as an opportunistic usurper, using her feigned sweetness to erase the memory of the true lady of the house. The image of Arthur showing Elena Isabella's favorite art book was the final straw. The jealousy and resentment, which had been dormant, awoke with a venomous fury. Mrs. Elvira convinced herself she was protecting her employer, protecting the sacred inheritance of her late mistress. She had to act, to open Arthur's eyes to the manipulation that, in her twisted mind, was as clear as day. That afternoon, she knocked on the office door. Her posture was rigid, her face a mask of false concern. "Sir, may I have a word?" she said, her voice heavy with rehearsed gravity. Arthur, who was reviewing reports from his investment funds, looked up, surprised by the formality. "Of course, Elvira. Come in." She entered and closed the door behind her. "Sir, I have worked for this family for many years. I saw the boy born, and I loved Mrs. Isabella like a daughter." She paused, letting the weight of her loyalty fill the silence. "That is why I feel it is my duty to warn you. I fear Miss Elena is taking advantage of your vulnerability. And the boys. Arthur put down his pen. A chill ran down his spine. What are you talking about, Elvira? I have watched her, sir, the housekeeper continued, her eyes downcast as if confessing something painful. The way she encourages him to call for her, the way she inserts herself into family moments. It seems to me she is trying to build an emotional dependency. She knows how much the boy means to you. And a woman in her position, well, the financial security this house offers is very tempting. Every word was a drop of poison, carefully chosen to trigger Arthur's deepest fears, the fear of being deceived, the suspicion his immense wealth always attracted, and the overwhelming guilt he felt for beginning to have feelings for another woman. The seed of doubt was planted. He, who had spent his life analyzing deals and detecting fraud, suddenly found himself questioning everything. Elena's spontaneity, her kindness. Was it all part of a plan? A long-term investment to secure a luxurious future? The memory of her smile in the library morphed, in his terrified mind, into a calculated grin. Arthur's face hardened, the cold mask of the suspicious multimillionaire snapping back into place. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. Mrs. Elvira glanced out the window. "In the garden, sir, where it all began." Arthur crossed the lawn toward the garden with the determined stride of a man heading into a hostile takeover. Every vibrant flower, every verdant leaf he saw, was no longer a symbol of healing, but a piece on a chessboard he hadn't realized he was playing. In his mind, poisoned by doubt and guilt, the garden's beauty became the facade of a successful operation. Elena hadn't been cultivating flowers, she had been cultivating influence. He was a man who had built his wealth, his immense fortune, on the cold analysis of risk and opportunity, and suddenly, she seemed like the greatest risk of all, an emotional liability he couldn't control, a long-term investment whose objective he now believed he fully understood. The tenderness he'd felt the night before now seemed like a dangerous naivety, a breach in his security system. He needed to cut his losses, to liquidate this sentimental investment before the damage spread to his entire emotional portfolio. He found her near the rose bushes, which had finally begun to bud. The scene was painfully peaceful. Elena was teaching Leo how to tell the scent of a rose from lavender. The boy, eyes closed, sniffed a small flower she held, and then a pure, radiant smile lit up his face. He laughed, a crystal-clear sound that mingled with the buzzing of bees. It was the sound of the purest happiness, a currency that didn't exist on the stock market. The sight of that joy, which should have warmed his heart, only served to freeze it further. To Arthur, that laugh was now proof of her plan's success, the dividend she was reaping from her manipulation. "Elena!" His voice cut through the air like a shard of glass. Leo's smile faltered and vanished. Elena turned, startled by the hardness in his tone. The man looking at her was not the vulnerable father from the night before, but the ruthless multimillionaire the business world knew and feared. "Sir, is something wrong?" she asked, rising and instinctively placing a hand on Leo's shoulder. "I need you to come with me." "Now," he said, ignoring her question. His gaze was glacial. He didn't look at his son. Elena felt a chill. She asked Leo to wait there for a moment and followed Arthur to a more secluded corner of the garden. "What's going on? You're scaring me," she said, her voice low. "This arrangement is no longer working," he began, using the corporate jargon that was his armor. "The lines between the professional and the personal have become blurred, and that represents a risk I'm not willing to take." Elena stared at him, confusion giving way to a sharp pain. "Risk? What are you talking about? Leo is laughing. He's talking. He's coming back to us." "He's becoming dependent on you," Arthur retorted, Mrs. Elvira's words echoing in his mouth. "And I cannot allow my son's vulnerability to be used as leverage." The word leverage hit her like a slap. She understood the accusation was so monstrous, so unfair, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. You actually think that all of this," she gestured to the garden, to the house, to where Leo stood, "is about money, about some kind of security?" Her chin trembled, but she held his gaze. "The only profit I have ever sought here, sir, was the sound of your son's laughter. I'm sorry your world is so poor that you can't see the value in that." The truth in her words stung him, but he was too proud to admit his mistake. To back down now would be to admit his own paranoia, his own guilt, and he couldn't. He needed to be in control. "This ends here," he decreed, his voice final, like a judge's gavel. "Mrs. Elvira will escort you to pack your things. Your final payment, including a generous severance package, will be deposited in your account tomorrow." He dismissed her with the same impersonality with which he would sell off a block of underperforming stock. Without another word, he turned his back. Elena stood paralyzed, her heart in pieces. She looked over at Leo, who was watching them from a distance, his small face contorted in confusion and fear. When Mrs. Elvira appeared at her side, a look of grim triumph on her face, Elena knew the fight was over. She gave the boy one last look, a silent goodbye that tore her soul apart, and allowed herself to be led out of the paradise she had rebuilt. Leo watched Elena walk away, escorted by the housekeeper. He saw his father's back turned to him, a statue of rigidity. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the departure. He opened his mouth to call out, to scream, "Stay!" But no sound came. The smile, the laugh, the new words, all retreated back inside him, like flowers closing at the touch of frost. He dropped the small rose he was holding. The flower fell to the ground, a vibrant splash of color on the dark earth. And then the silence, the old, dreaded enemy they had fought so hard to banish, returned to reclaim its kingdom. The color drained not just from the boy's face, but from the entire garden, from the entire world. The days following Elena's departure were a plunge into a silence deeper and darker than anything the mansion had ever known. Her absence was a physical presence, a vacuum that sucked the air and light from every room. Arthur tried to take refuge in the one thing he knew how to control, his empire. He dove into performance charts, analyzed the stock market, moved his capital between European investment funds and new cryptocurrencies. His net worth continued to climb, but every dollar, every euro added to his fortune only seemed to increase the weight of his misery. He looked at the numbers, but all he saw was his son's tear-streaked face and Elena's look of disappointment. He had liquidated the most valuable asset in his life over a rumor, an unfounded fear. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elvira, tried to restore the old order with meals served on a rigid schedule and impeccable cleaning, but it was like rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. The real wreckage was upstairs. Leo didn't just stop talking. He stopped living. He refused to eat, turning his face from any plate offered to him. He didn't play. He just sat in the armchair by the window, his gaze fixed on the now lifeless garden below, as if waiting for a mirage. Arthur called doctors, the best specialists his money could buy. They came, they examined, they asked questions, but their conclusions were vague and useless. There was no diagnosis for a broken heart. Arthur felt like the poorest man on earth, a billionaire bankrupt in everything that truly mattered. The house, with all its luxury goods, felt like a mausoleum he had built for himself. One night, driven by a desperation bordering on madness, Arthur entered his son's room. Moonlight filtered through the window, illuminating the small figure in the armchair. Leo was awake, and in his small, clenched fist, he held something. Arthur approached slowly, his heart pounding with a primal fear. Gently, he pried open his son's fingers. In Leo's palm lay a single rose petal, dried and broken. The petal from the flower he held in the garden, in that last moment of happiness. The sight of that fragile relic demolished Arthur's last defenses. The truth hit him, not as a thought, but as a physical certainty. He had been a fool, blinded by guilt and pride. With a frightening calm, he went downstairs. He found Mrs. Elvira in the living room, folding a blanket with methodical precision. He stopped in front of her. "It was a lie," he said. His voice devoid of anger, just a cold emptiness. "You lied to me." Mrs. Elvira paled but didn't deny it. "I did it to protect you, sir, to protect her memory," she whispered. "You protected nothing," he replied, his gaze cutting. "You used my wife's memory to hurt my son. There is no longer a place for your poisonous grief in this house. Pack your things." Without waiting for a reply, he went to his office, found Elena's file, and got her address. He drove through the dark streets, leaving the opulent, silent world of his mansion behind and entering the vibrant, noisy neighborhoods of the city. The smell of baking from a window, the sound of music, children laughing on the street. It was a wealth of life that confronted him with his own poverty. He found her street, a simple place with small houses and makeshift gardens in pots on the sidewalk. And then he saw her, under a streetlight. She was kneeling at a small community garden plot, tending to some seedlings with the same tenderness she had shown his garden. He got out of the car, feeling like an alien in this universe of authenticity. When she saw him, she stood up, her face closing into a mask of wounded pride. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold. "I came," he started, but the employer's words wouldn't come. The money was already deposited. "There's nothing left to discuss." "It's not about the money," he managed to say. "Elena, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." "Yes, you did," she said, not yielding. "My heart isn't one of your assets, sir. You can't sell it off and buy it back when the market shifts." The truth in those words disarmed him. All his arrogance, all his authority, crumbled. "Please," he begged, the word tearing at his throat. "I'm not asking as your employer. I'm begging as a father. Leo, he isn't eating, he's fading, he needs you." He looked at her, his eyes burning with unshed tears, the most powerful man she had ever known, now completely vulnerable. "I am asking for your forgiveness, not for him, for me." She saw the truth in his desperation, the agony of a terrified father. She hesitated, her heart torn between the pain of betrayal and her compassion for the boy. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "But I'm going for him, only for him." Elena's return to the mansion was quiet and solemn. There were no speeches, no promises. When she entered Leo's room, she found him just as Arthur had described, a small shadow huddled in the armchair, his gaze lost in the void. She knelt before him and, in a voice that was almost a whisper, began to sing a lullaby her mother used to sing to her, a simple melody about a garden that sleeps in winter to awaken in spring. Leo didn't move, but his eyes, once dull, blinked, a tiny spark of recognition. Arthur watched from the doorway, his heart a knot of hope and pain, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He backed away, giving them space, understanding that this was a reconstruction he could not lead, only support. The following days passed with a delicate slowness. Elena didn't force Leo to do anything. She was simply there. She brought his meals and ate beside him in silence, without insisting. She sat on the floor and read stories aloud to the walls, knowing he was listening. Little by little, she began to bring the garden into the room, a pot with a mint seedling, its scent filling the air, a bowl of water with daisy petals floating on top. Small pieces of life. The first victory came 3 days later. Elena was watering the mint when Leo stood up, walked to the pot, and touched one of the leaves with his fingertip. Then he looked at her. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. It meant he was coming back. Arthur kept a respectful distance, but his support was constant and discreet. He made sure Elena had everything she needed, that the house ran silently around that fragile bubble of recovery. He began to spend more time at home. his office becoming an observation post. He learned from her, watching her gestures. The power of patience, the beauty of improvisation. One morning, he came into the room with a tray. There was a plate for Leo and one for Elena. He sat on the floor with them and ate in silence. It was the first breakfast they had as a strange, patched-together family. And done for the first time in days, Leo picked up a piece of fruit and brought it to his mouth. The garden, now slightly neglected, became the next step. Elena took Leo by the hand and they went downstairs. Arthur followed. The three of them stood at the edge of the flower beds. Leo looked at the flowers, then at Elena, and then at his father. He walked to the pot where he had planted his own seedling, now a little wilted. He touched it sadly. That's when Arthur knelt beside him, picked up a small watering can, and filled it with water. He said nothing. He just offered the can to his son. Leo took it, and with intense concentration, watered his small plant. And then he looked up at his father, and in a voice still fragile but clear, he said, "Help." Arthur felt the tears finally stream down his face. Tears not of pain, but of a gratitude so deep it felt like it was washing his soul. He placed his hand over his son's on the watering can, and together they brought the little plant back to life. As the afternoon sun began to turn the ocean gold, the mansion felt like a completely different place. There was a peace that came not from silence, but from connection. Elena was in the garden, pruning a rosebush, her heart finally at ease. She felt her mission there was complete. She turned to leave, believing they could now move forward on their own. But Arthur met her at the white gate, the same gate that had once creaked with the weight of loneliness. "Eleanor, wait." She stopped, her gaze questioning. He didn't make grand promises, didn't speak of love, didn't try to fill her life with the wealth of his assets. He just looked her in the eyes, his vulnerability exposed. "The sound of my son's laughter is the first truly living thing I've heard in this house in years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And that started with you. Please, don't go. Don't teach us how to live again only to leave us." At that moment, Leo appeared at the garden door. In his hand, he held a flower, the first to bloom from his own seedling. He walked to Elena and offered it to her. Elena accepted it, tears streaming freely now, a smile illuminating her face. There was no kiss, no declarations, just a silent look between the three of them that contained everything essential. Some people don't come into our lives to save us, but to transform us, to teach us how to bloom again. And the gate, which once creaked, now stood open, as if the entire house, finally, was breathing again.